Um, okay, what I was saying is that there wasn't always a whole lot of fidelity between what actually happened in the classroom and what the method or the theory was supposed to be. So an example of that is the silent way, where the teacher is supposed to be silent, uh, and the teacher wasn't always silent. I can imagine it's probably very hard for a teacher to be silent. Um, so that's an example. And so some of the methods fall flat. I think what we want to do is borrow thoughtfully from, actually, there's no method that fails us completely. Even the grammar translation method, which is the first that came about and has really fallen out of favor. I really don't know any language teacher who doesn't use parts of grammar translation because you have to, there are certain things you have to memorize. There are grammar rules and vocabulary and things like that. And you have to translate at some point, especially in the very beginning. So we never want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Um, and so not to worry. So the test will feature some of those methods and the questions will not be hard and it's open book. So I don't want you to stress about that. If there's anything that I, only covered lightly, it will be in your bonus questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
So the test, that's on the 9th, right? So that's Thursday.
Yes.
Are we gonna take it in class or are we gonna take it on our own time?
You'll take it in class. Always so this class only has one test. And it's always difficult with the first one. I never know how long it will take. The majority of it is going to be multiple choice, but I'll be very generous with the time. So you report to class as normal, and I will email you the test. I'll be here to answer questions, and then you'll submit it in the Dropbox, the appropriate Dropbox. And I don't know if my goal is to have time afterwards to do some content. But if you guys are feeling like, oh God, this is long or this is more than I'm used to, I'm fine with taking more time. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. So Mandy came. Mandy. Did anyone else come? Hannah. Hannah, are you here?
I'm here.
Okay, good. And Mandy, you're here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good. I don't think there's anyone else who snuck in. Okay. So we're going to talk today about a little bit about linguistic imperialism. So here in this class, because we're talking about theories and principles, we get to think about our field of education and of teaching English and to be thoughtful and to critique. So let me share my screen. Okay. I'll leave it like that. Technically, this is like the fourth PowerPoint, but since the last two were on the same topic, I'm calling this PowerPoint 3. Okay, so what I want to do first is think about all the places where English is spoken. And I think it's probably more places than we normally think about, right? We think about parts of Canada and of course England and the United States, and we might think about parts of the Caribbean. But let's take a look at where English is spoken. Okay. Originating from Germanic languages in medieval England, today most English speakers live in former British possessions. So this is important for us to remember about any language, like the major languages that are spoken around the world were not the original languages, okay? Even outside of the Anglosphere, English often serves as a means to bridge the gap between diverse cultures, okay? Which is why it's so important to teach and to learn English. The English language is a global powerhouse. It is the third most common native language in the world, right? Only behind Spanish and Mandarin Chinese. So English is not the most common native language, but it's third. It is the mostly widely spoken second language in the world and an official language of the United Nations, the European Union, and many other international organizations and businesses. English is spoken as the primary language in many countries around the world, with the core traditional English-speaking states often referred to as the Anglosphere. But how did the English language become a global powerhouse in the first place? The history of the English language, like any language, is a long history filled with changes. The earliest form of English is called Old English. And by the way, none of us would recognize or be able to understand Old English at all. And developed from a set of North Sea Germanic dialects spoken by tribes, should be known as the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. By the 5th century, Anglo-Saxons had settled Britain, and by the 7th century, it was the dominant language of Britain. From the 8th through the 12th centuries, Old English transformed into Middle English through Norse colonization and Norman invasion. A major element of Norse influence was pronouns beginning with th, and Norman influences introduced a wide range of loan words. Middle English transitioned to early modern English from about mid-12th century until the 17th century through inflection simplification, simplifying linguistics, and the Great Vowel Shift. The Great Vowel Shift is when all Middle English vowels change their pronunciation. Uh-oh, someone must have gotten kicked off. Okay. By the late 17th century and onward, modern English started to form with codification of explicit norms for standard usage and the use of new forms of words. Okay. The English language spread with the growth and expansion of the British Empire. Starting in the late 16th century, Britain established its first colonies in the Americas. Following a colonial expansion and a series of victories over France and the Netherlands in the 17th and 18th centuries, England became the dominant colonial power in North America and India. Despite losing its 13th North American colony in 1783, the British Empire continued to expand elsewhere, turning to colonizing Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. So this is big. And you'll see when I show you some maps that it's big and it's not all good news. By 1922, the empire controlled 1/5 of the world's population and almost 1/4 of the Earth's land. This is Britain alone. Even in the areas it did not control, the empire exerted much economic influence since it dominated world trade. Following World War II, the British Empire declined greatly, losing most of its overseas possessions during the post-war decolonization period. Despite losing its empire, the British spread the English language around the globe with its world expanding colonies and economic influence that one can still feel today. Okay, almost finished. The English language today is cultural and economical, and it should say culturally and economically important to the world at large. Since the English language has the most speakers across the world, it is seen as the leading international language. It is considered a global lingua franca. Does anyone know what a lingua franca is?
It's like a language that is secondary to the people who use it. So like if your first language is Spanish and you're speaking with someone whose first language is French, you might both know English. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And for that
Cool.
reason, it carries, it's almost like money.
Right.
It's like currency. You know, it really is very valuable. Known as, thank you for that. Known as a common or trade language that makes communication between two foreign people possible, since the English language is so widespread globally. The English language also has a major cultural impact globally because of Americanization. And any of you who have traveled abroad, especially to certain continents, know that for some reason, America is valued culturally, right? Americanization really started with the rise of Hollywood. Who knew? In the 1920s, but really took off globally post-World War II, and then again in the internet age. This has led to American culture having an impact globally, which in turn also spreads the influence of the English language. What does the future hold for the English language? The English language is no longer, is in no danger of becoming extinct anytime soon, nor is it in danger of losing its spot as one of the world's most spoken and global languages. New words may come and go, but the English language seems like it will be globally strong into the very distant future. So actually, other languages are becoming distinct and extinct, languages that you probably haven't heard before. And this is a controversy. This is sad. There's debate about, like, should we be trying, as linguists and educators, should we be trying to preserve these languages that exist around the world? Or do we let nature take its course and the economy take its course and just let English take over? That's the million-dollar question, and we'll be talking about that. But here are all of the countries where English is the primary language. Doesn't mean that it's the official language, but it's the language that people speak. And if you'll excuse me, I think I'm getting a cold. I will be right back. Okay, thank you. So here are all the countries that use English as its primary language. I'm gonna just scroll through. They might be countries you haven't even thought of. You'll see that a lot of them are in the Caribbean. I can look at a handful right now. Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Dominica, those are all English-speaking Caribbean countries, British Virgin Islands, Grenada. But then we have countries on other continents like Australia, Ireland. Who knew that Ireland was colonized by the British? Did anyone know that? When we think of colonization, we think of countries in Africa and Asia. We think about India, but Ireland, the reason why when we go to Ireland and so many people don't speak the native tongue, they don't speak Gaelic, is because they were colonized by the British. The British took over so many places and said, hey, you're speaking our language. Okay, I'm going to continue to scroll through. Look at all these places. Singapore. My favorite high school teacher was from Singapore. I had never heard of Singapore before. And if you go to a website about Singapore, you'll see all the people are pretty dark brown. They look kind of Indian. My teacher happened to be white, but she spoke like she was from England, and so do many of the people from Singapore. And it's an Asian country. Okay, I have another handout that lists countries. I think it's a little bit more comprehensive. I'm going to show it briefly. So I like this list because it shows you the number of people in the population, the number of English speakers, and what percentage of the population they represent. So even though the number might look large, the percentage sometimes isn't. But there's great variation. Look at this. In Algeria, only 7% of the people speak English, but that represents 2.5 million people. Whereas in Anguilla, it's 92%, Australia is 97%. These handouts are also in your folder in D2L. It says handouts for the week of 9/6. So you can refer to these if you need to. Botswana, my goodness, Botswana is in Southern Africa, but almost half the people are English speaking. Brazil is very small, even though there are 10.5 million English speakers, they only represent 5% of the population. Most everyone speaks Portuguese only. Now, isn't this interesting? China, 10 million people speak English. That's a tiny percentage of the population. It represents less than 1%. So this is why there's tremendous demand for people like you, once you graduate, to go to certain Asian countries and teach English. It's very important to them. Italy only 34%, but that's 17 million people. So when we look at the raw numbers, lots and lots and lots of people speak English. Mexico, that number is only about 13%. That represents more than 15.5 million though. Pakistan, 49%. Portugal, only 27%. Russia, 5.5% only. This is so interesting.
I spent some time in Spain and I heard they have the lowest English fluency in Europe, which may or may not be true.
That might be true. They're at 22%, but let's look at France. Because France is notorious for not liking English.
Yeah, they
Oh, but they're
39%.
higher. So I think you're right. France is at 39%. Is that Manny talking?
No, it's Aiden.
Aiden, oh, Aiden came in. Okay.
Oh yeah, I was talking earlier too. No, I spent some time in Eastern Europe, and a lot of the college courses are taught in English, even though
Mm.
like I was in Slovakia where the native language is Slovak, but they teach higher education in English.
Oh, very
Okay.
interesting. Because when you think of Eastern Europe, you don't think of them using English.
Yeah, they were much more willing to practice than like people in Spain. You didn't even
You didn't even
try.
try.
No.
Slovakia, 26%.
Yeah,
Who knew?
it was cool. I had a really good time there, honestly,
Yeah.
but small country, but fun.
Very interesting. Okay, so again, thank you for sharing that. And again, this is in your folder in D2L. Very interesting information. So by the numbers, lots of people speak English. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint again. So I want us to keep that in mind. You don't have to memorize numbers. I just want you to get the lay of the land. For this course, we used to use a book by Sutani Mota, who is an Indian woman who writes about English teaching and race, English teaching and empire, English teaching and colonialism, post-colonialism. We didn't use enough of the book for me to say by the book, so we just used pieces of it. In her book, her trademark book, she talks about, in practical terms, about new teachers and how they experience, in particular, the teaching of English. And she follows a group of brand new teachers here in the United States and learns about kind of what they're exposed to and what their major questions are. So Sutani Mota says that aside from the mechanics of language and teaching methods, new teachers must negotiate an unfamiliar set of questions. These are new teachers who either have English language learners in their class or who are ESL teachers. First one, what does it mean to become an English teacher in a global context in which English carries tremendous social and cultural capital and economic power? Social and cultural capital and economic power. What does that mean? We talked about the term lingua franca, like English is almost like currency. So what does that mean for the person, you all, the teacher, who carry this currency? It's a heady question. Number two, how do teachers support their students' access to privileged forms of English while maintaining a critical eye toward the legacy of colonization and racialization in which the profession is embedded? And we'll explain that later. What is privileged forms of English? And I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but if you look at ESL textbooks over the years, say from the 70s to now, you will always find some textbooks that really don't offer the students privileged forms of English. The assumption is that even for higher level English language learners, that, well, that's an academic word. I don't think they're going to need that. And you'll find chapters in ESL books that are on things like hygiene. I find that particularly insulting since there are people from countries who have better hygiene than we have, but yet and still you have to learn English by learning hygiene. So what about privileged forms of English? Are we thinking that English language learners are bound for college? There's evidence that in the past, ESL teachers have not thought in terms of English language learners being bound for college. The fact of the matter is that many of them go to college. The fact of the matter is, and I'm talking about K through 12, but also with adults. You know, when I used to teach at El Centro, we had a free community ESL program that no longer exists, unfortunately. But I had all types of students. I had students who weren't educated, but who had lived a life and raised a family. I had one student in particular who stands out. He was a physician from the Dominican Republic. He knew a lot more than me about the sciences and was quite advanced in his profession and certainly did not need to learn about hygiene. So we have to be thinking with a critical eye about this. Number 3, how can teachers negotiate the racialized nature of the English language as they are teaching it, remaining mindful that there is a messy intertwining of English and whiteness? And we'll talk about that. But what I want us to remember is there are Englishes, world Englishes. There are so many versions of English, and the people who speak those versions of English may have English as their first language, but their English doesn't sound like our English. Our English doesn't sound like British English. Does that mean that our English isn't good enough? So before I move to the next question, I want to hear from you guys about that. I mean, just think about all the Englishes you hear just in Chicago alone. But if you travel to places like India, like Ireland, like Australia, like Britain, like Jamaica, like Belize, the United States, Canada. I mean, that's a drop in the bucket. Is that the term? So that's just a tiny portion of the different Englishes. Is there an English that is best? What do you think? There's no right or wrong. This is just discussion. I'm actually going to come out of this for a second.
As I told you in last class, we were on Zoom that in Iraq, because we were like in the 1920s, we were controlled by the British. Our English was so British, like we don't say dinner. We don't know the word dinner. We know supper. So we use the word supper. So then
and I bet you pronounce
2003
supper different than we pronounce supper beyond just the
and
vocabulary.
it's supper, like the R is silent. Right. So when we get like the pronunciation classes, mostly the R is like girl. We used to say girl. So you can tell the difference. Like it's really freaking because it's so different. So after 2003, when the war happened and we got to have satellites and more records came in and songs and stuff, and we start to watch more TV shows and stuff, we were like, oh, there's like different stuff. So when me and my brother, we start to speak that language, it was so much different than the one my dad used to speak. And Also, my dad got affected because he worked in India for 2 years, and he came back. He speaks in English like we don't even recognize. It's like, Dad, you're like an Indian guy,
Yes. And you
because
know what yeah, you know
he
what
had
we
a
call
friend that's
that?
Indian, and he used to come to our house. So my dad started to speak like him because he lived with him and worked in India for that 2 years.
That phenomenon is so fascinating, and it's called language contact.
Mhm.
It's actually why Chicagoans speak the way they do and New Yorkers speak the way they do. I mean, like, it's not random. It's
Yeah.
because, you know, like you've been influenced by a certain language over time. And it
Mhm.
really is fascinating.
Yeah,
But
they
I,
now my
even changed
question,
like the school material after like the English classes after 2003. They made it like more like to know how to. Before we were just about like grammar and Shakespeare stuff. Now, no, they're more expanding, and they have like to teach them how to talk more
good,
than
because no
just.
one speaks like Shakespeare, not even in
huh?
England.
Oh, it's freaking hard. Like the D, it's complicated. I didn't like it at all.
Thank you for sharing, Aya.
Of course, of course.
So now, and anyone can answer this. So does that mean that one English is better than the other or better than another? What do you think? And what do you think people think? If you
Can I
don't
make
want
a
to,
comment?
Aiden?
Before taking any of the ESL classes, I had a discussion with a friend, and I brought up standard English, and they said there should be no such thing as standard English because like all Englishes are valid, which I agree. But I'm like, what if you read like a doctor's note and it said like ain't? Like, I think there's context where stuff is. So I think, better or worse aside, I think standard English is there for a reason, because there is like a most correct when it comes to like written stuff. There is like a baseline, and then
Uh-huh.
variations on that are fine in a lot of contexts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think what was really important that you just said, like better or worse aside, because what we're talking about is standard. And in any country, in any society, there has to be a standard. However, you know, what we have found, what research has found is that people who aren't linguists, many people who aren't linguists, tend to rank dialects and they tend to rank languages. Like, have you ever heard someone swoon over a British accent? Like, if someone who's British says it, then probably has to be true, right? And then when people hear French, they just melt. But when they hear Polish, they don't melt. Like, what is that? And then the variations of English, and we'll be talking about African American English. That's just one American variation of English. There are many. We'll be talking about Spanglish and all of that. But I think it's important for us to know that the linguist's motto is that, you know, all language variations are equivalent. That's not to say there shouldn't be a standard. So yeah, they agree with you, Aiden, and I do too. And then Amanda made a comment. Oh, Amanda, you've been to Antigua, so have I, and I love it. You just went. So here you wrote, I've been to Antigua this summer, and they definitely speak another language. They also have a Jamaican dialect. So I have to argue with you on that. They use a different variation of English, which is not necessarily another language, but it may be hard to understand, especially if we're kind of eavesdropping in on a conversation of, say we're at a restaurant in Antigua, and next to us is a group of Antiguans and they're speaking English, and we listen in. You know, they're not taking care to speak slowly so you can understand it because they're speaking to one another. But they don't have a Jamaican accent. but probably to many Americans, it sounds Jamaican because there's some similarities. Believe it or not, every Caribbean country sounds different. Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad. I'm pretty good at hearing for those differences, but you're right. It sounds like Jamaican accent. And the reason for the differences, though, is because they're on islands. And we'll talk about that in the future. Like, if there's a population on an island, no matter where it is, that language is going to become more and more unique in each generation because they're isolated. Yep. Hannah says, my best friend lives in the Bahamas. Yes. So the Bahamas accent, to me, it sounds so British to me. Does it sound that way to you, Hannah?
Yes.
And I've been to the Bahamas and I've been to Bermuda, and they sound much more British than other Caribbean countries. All of them were colonized by Britain, but for different lengths of time and at different times. So it's interesting to trace back and see, like, why do they sound so British? I mean, most of the Caribbean was colonized by Britain, and then you have to figure it out. But yeah, it's fast. I actually don't care for the Bahamas or Bermuda to vacation because they're too British. They're too formal. Give me Jamaica or Barbados or Trinidad. Okay, let me continue. Mota poses question number 4. How do teachers' consciousnesses of their own racial identities become salient in their practice? And this is about being reflective. Like, all teachers should be reflective about everything that they do and how their beliefs translate to their teaching. And that includes understanding your own identity as a teacher, okay? Number 5, and what about the media representation of language minority students? What have our students been exposed to all their lives here in the United States? And what have we been exposed to? There isn't much of it, but think about it. Think about our exposure to language minority people in the media. What has it been like? Do people see themselves, and how do they see themselves? You know, as an African-American woman, when I was young, when I was very young, there was like only one TV show that had Black people on it, and it was called Julia. Have you guys heard of Julia? Nobody?
No.
I feel so old. So
No.
Julia, you can look it up on YouTube. Julia was a TV show about a single Black mom who was a nurse. So she had a profession. Like, this is the first time. It used to be like in movies, we would see Black women and they were always the maids. But here we have a nurse, and she had her own apartment, and she was such a good mother. And like, it was so important to the Black community that when that TV show came on, or when you saw a commercial with the Black person, you would call your neighbor, turn on channel 2, hurry up, right? And now things are much different. You know, we have, not only do we have more TV shows and commercials with Black people, it's less stereotyped. So when Black people first started coming on TV, like, it was very, very stereotyped. There's less of that, you know, and language minority students in particular, you know, because Spanish is the most prominent first language of English language learners, we think about Latinos in the media. Latinos in mainstream media and how are they projected? You know, the first television show I can think of that featured a Latino family was what? Now I forgot the name of the show. It was, the father was a comedian. Does anyone, no one watched it?
It's George Lopez.
Lopez.
Yes,
Is it
George
the George Lopez
Lopez's
one?
show.
Wasn't that like the 90s?
That was in the 90s.
That's insane that's like, yeah.
Yeah, it is insane, but it's,
I remember
it's
watching
a
it when I was
fact.
young.
And so here we have lots of people believing that all Latino families are like that family. It happens for every group. So we have to be really conscious about that as teachers and try to counteract that, especially when we're with young children or any children.
I remember with the Bernie Mac show that he said they really wanted him to do like a quote unquote black show. And he was like, I really just want to do like a comedy show. Like I happen to be black, but like I don't want it to be really typecast, you know. He wanted it to be a
Right.
wide audience, which it was.
It was one of the few shows besides like Cosby that got a wider audience,
Yeah.
wider with the D. Before that, you know, you couldn't really get a job unless you were willing to be typecast.
Mm-hmm.
So, and even if you ever watch Telemundo, there are issues in Telemundo too. Has anyone watched the telenovelas? Is there anyone who's
Like a
Spanish?
specific
Yeah.
one.
Culture professor.
Okay, who's watched telenovelas?
I have.
Okay, Evelyn, what have you noticed? Anything that stands out? Like if you step away and be like a fly on the wall, what do you think?
They're very dramatic.
Yeah, they're extremely dramatic. They kind of remind me of the Bollywood movies. Those are very dramatic.
I used to, well, I didn't watch them. Like my grandma, she would have the TV on and like the telenovelas or like novelas would be playing in the background. And I
Yeah.
remember them being really dramatic. It's either they're an orphan or they're poor and they somehow become rich. And then, but yeah,
What about the people on the telenovelas? What did you notice
No.
about them? Manny? Is that Manny?
Yes, it's Manny. I grew up in Mexico and I watched the Mexican telenovelas, and they're
Oh.
completely different than the newer telenovelas. Because as they're being produced for Telemundo by Telemundo, we're having the Mexican American actors rather than Mexican actors. And some of the older
Oh, you're going in and out. Oh, I really want to hear what you have to say. Oh, no. Uh-oh, I think we lost him. Hopefully he'll come back. Any other comments about telenovelas? Oh, here he is.
I'm having internet issues.
Okay, can you repeat what you were saying? Because we didn't hear most of what you were saying, Manny.
So basically, a lot of telenovelas are being influenced by American soap operas, and they're not as good as they were back in the 90s.
I believe that because the quality of television, period, has gone down, with the exception of some of these series shows. But yeah, no, to be influenced by sitcoms is an awful thing. What about the people? What I have noticed is they tend to be white. They tend to be very light.
Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of newer Mexican American or even mostly Hispanics or Latinos that are influencing so in so then it's like a lot of the actors of the Mexican actors and are not involved with these telenovelas, and they lose a lot of that. I like to call it better act because for us and because the acting was so bland and boring.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really important to note. And even the telenovelas that are not out of Mexico and not for a majority Mexican American population, say they're Puerto Rican and Dominican, most of those people are brown and dark brown, but the people on the TV shows are so light. So it's these little things that we have to notice and remember and know that our children are seeing that and wonder, what are they thinking? You know, what do they conclude? English as a contradiction. The light cast by someone else's lamp. That's an idiom. That's a phrase that serves as a metaphor for the multiple possible ways for us to think about the acquisition of English. What colors each person's approach and experience teaching and learning English? What colors their lens, in other words, is what we have to think about. So I want you to see if I can make this. This part won't go away. I wanted to make this a slideshow, but I can't. Okay, just do this. So I want you to close your eyes and think about English. And think about what images come to mind. Actually, I'm not even going to ask you guys to do that. But what I will tell you is that it has been asked in research of people around the United States to do this, to tell what comes to mind when they think about English. Who do you imagine when you think English speaker? And especially, who do you think about when you think native English speaker? Because, you know, when they look for English teachers in like certain countries like Korea, not too many countries still do this, but they mean something very specific when they say native English speaker. Okay. And so studies have been carried out to find out what people think of when they think of native English speaker and who is the immigrant ELL. And they usually guess the wrong person, for instance, when shown two pictures, right? So the immigrant ELL in this case is the person with the check mark, okay? And that person is not the one that people guess. People assume it's the woman on the left. Okay, you know these two actors. Neither of them are English language learners or were English language learners, but the immigrant is on your left, not on your right, whereas people think, oh, it's the one on the right. Okay, the immigrant English language learner here is from a Scandinavian country and is on your right. Okay, the immigrant is on your left and she's from an Eastern European country. Okay, she was an English language learner, but the person on your right, born and raised in the US. Okay, people might think because of the texture of someone's hair that maybe they're from another country, maybe they're an English language learner. No, it's the person on the left who was an immigrant English language learner. So assumptions are made. Assumptions are made in every arena, you know, not just this arena, but we have to be aware of the assumptions. research tells us that there are certain phrases that people associate with English. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's good to know. So, phrases that people associate with English: social advancement, opportunity, modernity, so being very modern, wealth, enlightenment, that one surprises me, whiteness, that kind of surprises me too, and cosmopolitanism. So they think that English is very cosmopolitan. That's interesting because I think many English speakers, native English speakers, especially in the US, think of like French as very cosmopolitan. So these are all the words and phrases that people associate with the English language. And this is why it is so coveted. It is a lingua franca and it's very valued. For many years in the US, immigrant parents were encouraged to speak only English to their children so that the new language would replace the old. That was the goal. Okay. Now, this isn't something that was an old wives' tale or something that was promoted by a certain segment of the population. This is something that was promoted by the government, by our school systems. Part of it was probably that they didn't know better, but school systems would tell immigrant families to dispose of your culture, dispose of your language. Make sure that your children replace their native tongue with English. And that's the way to assimilate. And we always want to assimilate because that means that your child will be more successful. So that was the ideology, even as recently as the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. I know that doesn't sound recent, but for me, I was born in the 60s. So the 60s and the 70s feels recent. And I would argue that even in the 80s, thinking back to the kids who were English language learners in the New York City school system with me, yeah, the idea was to get rid of that old culture and the language. You know, it's nice to have it, but you know, we don't want to really hear it. This was particularly successful with English learners in the US. Immigrants to other countries seem to manage to maintain their mother tongue, although English was highly valued, always highly valued. Losing my voice. Let me reiterate. In the United States, it was the government that asked immigrant families to try to dispose of their language and culture and replace it with English, and that was the message that you'd be more successful. However, immigrants to other countries, even England, they did not receive this message. They were able to maintain their culture and their language. In other English-speaking countries like Canada, Scotland, Ireland, England. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that the United States was different? And now I can't remember if I told you about a very good friend of mine. Did I tell you about Carol Bustamante? Evelyn, does that sound familiar? Her name, Carol Bustamante. I don't think I told you guys about her.
Oh,
Okay. She's a friend of mine who, let's see, I'll be 56 next month. She's like 59. And we used to work together. We both taught at Robert Morris University. And she is a Latina. She and her two sisters grew up in Chicago. Her parents came to the United States from Mexico at a very young age. And the message back then was make sure that your child fully assimilates. You probably don't want to teach them the language. What? What? You are kidding, Derica.
Yeah, she's actually like one of my favorite teachers that I've ever had, honestly.
She's one of my best friends.
Really, that's crazy.
Oh,
I
I'm gonna
love
tell
her.
her.
I love her.
Maybe I should be using not her real name, but a pseudonym. Oh, I don't know if she ever shared with you that her parents never taught her any Spanish.
I don't remember. I don't think so.
Okay. So like they thought that the best thing would be not to teach Spanish to their daughters. And also they were not allowed to wear pink or red or ruffles because that the parents associated that with Mexico and thought that if they didn't wear those things, then they would be better off and would be more successful. And Carol and her sisters, they're doing just fine, but you know, they have peers who still speak Spanish who are also doing fine. And there's some resentment there. Of course, now we know that having more than one language is good for the brain and it actually makes you smarter. But you know, it makes her sad that she can't speak a lick of English. And by the time she realized she wanted to learn, it was so hard to learn. But this is something that was commonplace, not just in Chicago. I'm telling you, in every major city, it happened in New York too. That was the message. But why do you think the message was so strong here and not in, say, England, where English first started? And I don't know the answer. I'm just trying to pick your brain, guys.
Could it be that assimilation has been like it's been more emphasized? Like there was like a certain time period? Because I feel like
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
because I feel like back then it was like they wanted everyone to be like American, like there was an ideal image of being American.
Yeah,
So then
yeah.
that was encouraged.
So you made me think of something that I hadn't thought of. Like, this country is relatively new compared to like in England. So maybe that has something to do like with there's this image. Um, but luckily, you know, research has shown and education systems have changed because now we know that that's not the way to go for a variety of reasons. Um, you know, children feel more confident and are more successful academically when they are in touch with their heritage. And that's the reason why nowadays, I don't know if you guys have heard of heritage schools. So heritage schools have always existed, but in the past 10 years, they've grown by leaps and bounds. I can remember when I was young that the Jewish community had heritage schools. They would go on Saturday to learn Hebrew. That was important. But now there are heritage schools for Polish children and even adults, um, for people from Spanish speaking heritage, all sorts of backgrounds, because now people are like, oh my goodness, we don't want to lose our language and our heritage. So we're kind of going in the opposite direction now, which is nice to see. Let me pull this back up. Okay, I'm going to show this I think I'll be able to show 2 short videos before we end. This first one is on European imperialism. You know, in K through 12, they don't teach us much history. So I'm trying to fill in a little bit. Let me show this first one. Stop share. And then Oh, here it is.
Can you hear the video, Professor?
Oh, you can't hear it. Okay, let me start again. Sorry about that. Ah. Okay, let me do this again.
What is imperialism and why did it happen? By the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer both of these questions. First, let's define imperialism. Imperialism occurs when an industrialized nation takes control of other nations' lands or territories for economic or political gain. Money and power are the two biggest reasons for the growth of imperialism. But what made it possible? Industrialized nations had factories and machinery that could produce weapons, giving them a military advantage, allowing them to conquer and control a large population of people in a foreign land. The wealth these countries had allowed them to pay for large armies to go out and conquer and control other nations, putting them under their control. Steamships allowed industrialized nations to travel farther and faster, carrying large amounts of cargo and troops. New medicines made it easier to treat diseases found in foreign lands. The telegraph increased communication, and railroads united large areas of land, making the movement of goods and people faster and cheaper. These modern weapons and advantages will make conquering native peoples in places like Africa and Asia relatively easy. Because these lands and people never industrialized, they were at a huge disadvantage. When lands were conquered, they became colonies. Add all the colonies together, and an industrialized nation now has an empire. It was the job of these colonies to produce resources and wealth for the mother countries. The colonies also supplied cheap labor as a new market to buy manufactured goods. For example, India was colonized by the British. India had lots of resources and a population of over 300 million people. The British would take a resource like cotton, ship it from India to England, where the cotton would be made into textiles. The finished textiles would be sent back to India and sold to the Indian people. The British could also ship and sell their goods to other colonies in Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and Africa, generating huge profits for England. Since England is getting the raw material basically for free and then selling it around the globe, they're going to generate a huge profit. England passed laws stopping India from making their own textiles or buying them from any other nation. This relationship was good for the British, but terrible for the Indian people. Competition with other industrialized nations also motivated Europeans to go out and seek more resources. If your neighbor was doing it, that meant you had to do it too. Unless, of course, you wanted them to become more wealthy and more powerful than you. Competition amongst the other industrialized nations of Europe drive imperialism, and unfortunately, underdeveloped places like in Africa and Asia will suffer the consequences. That leads to the next reason for imperialism, called nationalism. Nationalism was the belief that your nation or people were superior to all of the nations and people. The best way to prove this was to have the most of everything and the biggest empire. A nation's wealth and empire were status symbols. The more you had, the greater you were. Europeans also believed that they were a superior race, choosing to spread their knowledge and culture around the world and to civilize lesser developed people in other parts of the world. This belief was known as social Darwinism. Spreading Christianity was also another reason for imperialism. European Christians wanted to convert foreign people to Christianity and justified conquering these people in order to save their souls. By 1914, European nations had colonized over 90% of Africa. They forced their language and religion on the native people, took away all of their traditional governments, redrew political boundaries, promoted ethnic and tribal conflicts, used forced labor of native people, took their resources, and caused famine and disease, killing millions of native African people. The most notorious actions took place in the Belgian Congo. In 1876, King Leopold II of Belgium claimed the area of the Congo as his own personal colony. The main source the main resource found in the Congo was rubber, a new product in high demand and therefore very valuable. Leopold forced millions of Congolese people to work day and night, gathering rubber sleeves, cut off the hand of anyone who failed to meet the rubber quota. Others were whipped and beaten to death. Villages were raided, women and children were raped and killed, and millions died of malnutrition and starvation because they were not able to tend to their crops. No one knows for sure, but it's estimated between 10 and 20 million people died in the Congo during Leopold's rule, which lasted till the colony was taken by the Belgian government in 1908. Other European nations continued to control colonies in Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, the West Indies, the South Pacific, and the Caribbean. Great Britain and France and Germany will emerge as the top 3 European powers, and they will continue to try expanding their power all the way until the start of World War I. So, in conclusion, the biggest motivator for imperialism was economics, followed by national pride, competition with the nations, racism, and religion. Imperialism changed the world. Our question is, what impact will this have on the native people of these colonized places?
Okay. I will end there because I only have like 4 more minutes, but I want you to think about that. Like, even though these places were colonized a long, long time ago, there are lasting effects of colonization, of having your culture and your language taken away. And we'll continue to talk about this next time. Are there any comments or questions before we end? We'll have the test will be first next time. And then if there's any more time, we'll continue. If we don't have much time, we'll have to continue next week. But
I'm sorry if you already brought this up, but how is that test going to look? Is that like?
so it'll be a combination of multiple choice, short answer, and probably 1 essay. And it's open book. It'll be mostly multiple choice though.
So is that taking place during class?
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah, we talked about this before you came, that so show up to class, on time, and I'll email everybody the test, but I'll be here to answer any questions. And at the end, you put it in the appropriate Dropbox in D2L.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I'm here if you need me. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.
See you on Thursday. Okay, you too. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.